Right, WordPress for the modern developer. So this is me, I'm Chris, I work at Wheelbase, and I am a web application engineer. This is my first talk I've ever given. It's quite technical as well, and my throat's quite dry at the moment, so I'm going to do my best for you. Lots of people, lots of great developers and speakers have encouraged me to get into doing a talk. So thank you to them. And no more though than Jenny Wong. So Jenny did a talk in December. She's a WordPress and PHP community cheerleader, and she gave a talk about getting WordPress and PHP communities to work better together. And that got me thinking about why, as PHP developers, we generally dislike WordPress and dislike working with it. And really we shouldn't. The internet is 23% of it is powered by WordPress, and that's all of the internet. If we think about just the content managed sites, that's a 60% market share, approximately, of content managed sites that run in WordPress. And WordPress is written in PHP. And as PHP developers, we've got a growing number of tools that we use to help our development on a daily basis. But we don't use them with WordPress that much. And I think this is where the dislike comes in. We don't use them because either we think that they're difficult to use, or we'll have to make too many compromises to our code base. I'm going to talk you through how we've made the best use of WordPress, what we installed with our WordPress installed. And I'm going to start with version control. Specifically, Git. Git helps us keep track of the changes we make to our code. Git is vital because we can see who's changed what and when. Multiple people can work on the same files at the same time. We can work on features in parallel, and we can roll back to previous versions. All of these are quite important, but none more so than getting home on time. And Git really helps us achieve that. Now, if you've not used WordPress before, you could do a lot worse than just to add your entire WordPress site into Git. That's a great start. But we can be a bit smarter than that, and we can keep track of only the files that we need to, only the files that we're changing. This gives us a smaller repository size, which gives us smaller diffs, smaller pull requests, and makes it generally easier to manage. So let's think about who's actually making changes to our code. Well, there's us. There's us as developers, we're making changes to our code. But with WordPress, there's also our users making changes to our code, because WordPress lets its users edit things like style sheets through the WordPress admin interface. So to start off, I'm going to take control of this. So here's your standard WordPress install. And I'm going to start editing in wp-config. wp-config here is the WordPress configuration file. And between this file and the database, all our settings for WordPress are stored. I've added a few lines here, hopefully you can see them. The first one here disables automatic updates. Interestingly, if WordPress detects that you're using version control, it will turn automatic updates off anyway. I'm not sure why it does that. It doesn't really. I found this deep in the WordPress codex somewhere. But I've just put it here just to be explicit about the fact that I want to turn those off. Then I've added a couple of more lines here, and this stops my users from being able to install or update plugins and themes. That's important because any changes to our code base, we want to be the ones making it, not our users. So now we've made a change to wp-config. Let's commit that up to our repo. That's a good first step. But there's a whole load of other files in here that we don't want to touch. I don't know what half these do really. They're all part of WordPress. And in fact, the only other file we want to be folder we want to be concerned with is the WP content file here. This keeps our plugins and our themes and our uploads, and that's where we do our development. So let's tidy this up. Now, since WordPress 3.5, hopefully we're all using WordPress 4 or beyond, we can make some changes to our structure that we use with WordPress. So what I've done is I've created this folder here called WordPress, and I've put the WordPress core installation file inside there. WP config here, that's not a core part of the WordPress core. It's created by the wizard when you first install WordPress. WordPress will actually look for this file inside the WordPress, the same root directory as WordPress, or in one directory above it. So that's absolutely fine to be there still. But I need to let WordPress know that I've moved all the files into this WordPress folder. Okay, so first a quick change to WP config again. So here's the where the absolute path is defined, and all I'm going to do is just add WordPress there. It's as simple as that. I also need to make a change to our database though. Our database has these things called site URL and home URL. And most of the time they're the same thing. But we've moved WordPress, the WordPress core install. So now that lives in /WordPress. If you're sat there wondering what the difference between site URL and home URL is, it took me a while to really work this one out, but essentially it's just site URL is where WordPress core files will be found, and your site URL is just where your site is. There's more technical explanations between the difference between the two, but it essentially just comes down to those two things. So the files that I'm actually going to be editing are lost well within WordPress here in WP content. So what I've done is I've created a WP content folder here. You can call this whatever you like. I've called it WP content just for backwards compatibility, and I'll explain that in a little bit. And then I've moved my plugins and my themes and my uploads into WP content. So now I need to let WordPress know where to find this. So I just add these lines here. If you sat there thinking, how am I going to keep track of all of this, I will be putting these slides up online afterwards, so you don't need to commit these to memory. So yeah, it's just a couple of lines there, tells it where to find the content because I've moved it. So now here you see we have a clear separation between the WordPress core files and our application files, as I like to call them. We could go a step further here if you sat there thinking this is a little bit insecure, and move WP content, WordPress, and our index file into a new folder and make that our web accessible directory that our server serves, which would mean that Git and WP config are outside the web root. That would be a good step. I've just omitted that because I didn't want to make this too complicated. It's pretty complicated already. Okay, so now I've added WordPress to my Git ignore because I don't need it. I'm not going to be editing anything to do with WordPress. All the stuff I'm going to be editing is in the WP config folder that I've made. So now I get Dave to go and clone my repo. So Dave clones my repo. And you can see that it's a WordPress installation by looking at some of the files in there, but it doesn't have WordPress. So Dave will probably think, okay, I need to go and install WordPress. So he'll download WordPress, but he'll be getting the latest version of WordPress. How does he know what version of WordPress he needs to get? Excuse me. Well, he doesn't. WordPress is a dependency of our project. We need WordPress, the WordPress core files, for our project to work. But without knowing what version of WordPress we need, we could put an old version in there and things could break. So we need to manage that somehow. We need to manage our dependency. And that brings me to dependency management. PHP has a dependency manager. It's called Composer, and it's fantastic. Last month, Michael Cullen did a talk which was mostly about Composer. So that was really good if you were here for that. He went through a lot of the basics of Composer. I'm afraid I'm going to skip over that, and the stuff I'm going to be talking about with Composer is a little more complicated. Composer is not popular with mainstream WordPress developers for some reason. There's a general misconception that WordPress is some way incompatible with Composer's workflow. What if I told you that at base, we use Composer with WordPress? Now, unfortunately, WordPress itself isn't a Composer package yet. There is an issue up on WordPress.org, and it's been there for 23 months. About half of the course. Yeah. Thankfully, there's a guy called John Block, I think I've said his name wrong, but, and he made a package for us that we can require with Composer. So here we go, this is my composer.json, and all of that is required John Block / WordPress, and I've required 4.1. Okay, so this is the repository. It's an automated fork of the WordPress core, and it updates every 15 minutes, so it's always up to date. If we were to make our own repository for this, we'd have to keep WordPress, we'd have to make a new one, or do something fancy like John Block has done, to keep WordPress up to date. But we can just require this, which is excellent. Composer packages have a default type, which is library, and they install to vendor. So if you're used to using Composer, you will know that everything just ends up in the vendor folder, and then the name of the package. This package installs to WordPress /WordPress, the WordPress directory, which is why I named my folder for the WordPress core files to be WordPress. This is where I get a little bit advanced with Composer. Don't worry if you get lost there, it's not going to be too long. So to explain how it does this, WordPress, John Block's WordPress package depends on something called a custom Composer installer. And he's made one specifically for this WordPress package. Once recognized, it will completely override the default installer for Composer, and it will use its own installation logic, so that it will be able to install to /WordPress. So this custom Composer installer defines its type as WordPress core and installs the WordPress folder. It also gives us the ability to overwrite this if we want to. So here's how we do that. We just add an extra definition here with WordPress install directory to our Composer JSON. And if I wanted to shorthand WordPress to be WP, or I want to put it somewhere completely different, I can tell Composer where I want to put this file. Okay, well, because mine's called WordPress already, I don't need to do that. So that's the complicated Composer stuff. If we want to update WordPress, it's as simple as just adding, incrementing this number. So WordPress 4.1.1 it out. So I literally just add a 0.1 to the end of that, and then Composer install. And my WordPress is now up to date. This is powerful because WordPress with Composer means we can't break the production site with incorrect versions of our packages. It's self-documenting. We can see what version of WordPress we're using with our site. And there's no more third-party code in our version control. Or is there? So we've got WordPress here now being installed by Composer, and it's no longer part of our version control. But what else is a dependency? Well, our plugins are a dependency, and our themes are a dependency as well. Plugins and themes. As with WordPress core, plugins are not Composer packages either, unfortunately. Now we could create and host our own custom repository for each of the plugins and themes that we use within our WordPress site, but that's going to take us quite a while to do and be quite laborious. Thankfully, there's another brilliant thing, which was created by a company called Outlandish, which is called WordPress Packages. WordPress Packages is a custom repository that provides a near real-time mirror of WordPress's plugin directory. So basically, if it exists on the WordPress plugin site, it exists here as a Composer package. So you can require it with Composer. And these use something called Composer installers as well. So plugins and themes are defined their package type as WordPress plugin and WordPress theme, and they install where you'd expect them to. And for this reason, I called my application folder WP content, so that my plugins and my themes will install exactly where they expect to. I'm not sure what that's about. So here we go. Sorry if this is really difficult to read. So I've got WordPress here, and then I've added a couple of plugins. So I've got advanced custom fields, and I've acquired a specific version of advanced custom fields, or at least a major version. The star means that I'm not bothered about the minor version, so when I compose and install it, will just get the most up-to-date minor version. Not all plugins will have semantic versioning, so you can either just use a star and just get any version. That's not so nice, or unfortunately the best thing you can do is email the person who made the plugin and tell them, oi, use semantic versioning. So my tips for getting getting this right is to go to the plugin site and just take the string from here of what the plugin is called, which is exactly the same as what the package type will be called, and then go to the changelog and find out what version you need. You can also do require dev. So this means when we run compose and install and we run it with the parameter require dev, we can install in packages which are specifically just for development. So I've got the WordPress debug bar plugin here, which I'd want when I'm developing locally, but I wouldn't want that on my production server. So running compose and install will not install anything in the require dev. So again, that's a really powerful feature of Composer. If we have different content in different folders, we can make some installer pass rules. So here, for example, instead of calling my application folder WP content, I've called it app. And then I've created these rules here, which define anything of the type WordPress MU plugin will go into app MU plugins. And same for plugins, and same for themes. But what about our own plugins? We are also doing custom development in as plugins that are not third-party plugins that we're just going to be plugging and playing with. So option one is to just leave it in the repo. It will be perfectly happy living in the same repo as your Composer plugins, as long as it doesn't have the same name. But we can also host them in a private repository, such as Bitbucket or GitHub. And that's really great because we can keep our own versioning. So, for example, I can make a plugin, and I can tag it with version 1, and then on my first site I can use that version. And then I can make a second WordPress site. I can make some improvements to this plugin, tag it as version 2, and use it on my second site. But my first site, that might break some backwards compatibility maybe, but I don't have to use version 2 on my first site. I can keep that locked to version 1. So that means that I don't have to keep maintaining lots of different repositories for lots of different versions of my plugin. I can just use the versioning and require whichever version I need of that plugin. Composer doesn't require your package to be publicly available either. So at base we have a couple of plugins that we are only using internally at the moment, and we haven't open sourced yet. So we can just host them privately, and we can still require them using Composer. To make a custom repository for your plugin, you'll need to add a Composer JSON file to the plugin. So everything I've been talking about so far has been my sites that I'm developing. This is now a repository for my package, which is for my plugin. The key lines here are the name of the plugin, which is what I'm going to be requiring. So we are base/my plugin. And the type here, so I've defined the type as WordPress plugin. I've also included as a dependency the Composer installers, so that people can change where this installs to. So now we're back to our WordPress site. You see here I've required WeAreBase, my plugin, and approximately version 1. Up here I've added a repository of the type version control system, so that doesn't lock it to Bitbucket or GitHub specifically. And then I've added the URL of where that plugin is actually found on Git. So when I Composer install it, it will go away to my private repo, and it will install my plugin and it will put it in the plugins folder. This is really nice because it also means you completely avoid the laborious process of having of uploading your own plugin to the WordPress plugins, which I think we all agree is a good thing. So a quick look at our git ignore then. So we had WordPress in there before. I've added plugins, MU plugins, and uploads, which I'll come to in a little bit, to my git ignore because we don't want to add any of these to our repo either. The git keep just means that it keeps the folder itself, the empty folder in the repository, but it doesn't include any of the contents. And I've also got vendor added down here because anything that gets installed to vendor I don't want in my repo either. That's what Compose is for. So now what I'm actually committing to my repo is really small. Have you noticed we're using MU plugins here? Some of you might be wondering how we're doing that, because MU plugins are single files. They don't work within directories at all. We're using something called the Bedrock Autoloader, which is part of the Bedrock project. And essentially that is an MU plugin which allows you, which when that gets loaded in, it allows you to use normal plugins as MU plugins. Why you want to do that? Well, it's mainly because MU plugins get loaded in first before regular plugins. There's a bit of a catch-22 here. You have to add this to your repo. You can't require this because it's needed for you to then require other plugins as MU plugins. But I think it's fine to have in your repo. It's only a small MU, little PHP script. Okay. Downsides to this. You might have a client like a friend actually, who I manage the WordPress site for, and he likes to install his own plugins, and he also likes to update WordPress. He hates seeing that WordPress is one minor version out of date, and he'll be on the phone to me going, "Why is WordPress out of date?" So if you have a client like that, this isn't going to work for you, because if they want to install their own plugins, then it's not going to work with the Compose workflow. But I'd seriously question why they are the ones adding the plugins. It means that you've got external forces which are altering the code that should be contained in your version control, and it's not going in there. And every time they make a change, your version control's out of date instantly. So I don't generally recommend that at all, and I think it's good to move over to using Composer. Section 4, environment. I didn't find a good picture for this, so this is the place where your code will run. As developers, this is usually more than one place. Production servers, staging servers, local machines, virtual machines, a Raspberry Pi if you want. They all have different settings. Some are stored in WP config, which I've shown before, such as the database settings, connection details, sorry. Others are in the WP options table that's in WordPress, such as site URL and home URL. Now, our production database is constantly being updated with new data, which our users will be adding in, like blog posts and things like that. So when I go to develop locally, I'm going to want to have those locally to develop with, so I've got an up-to-date database. So that usually means having to dump the database out to the production database, import it locally, and then have to go through and change all these settings because this host name is not my host name anymore. It's something like localhost, or if I put it on my staging server, it would be staging.mysite.com. And that's a repetitive task. What's even worse is that every time you load a page in WordPress, you go into your browser, you load a site that's built on WordPress, it has to come to this database just to find out what its site URL is. And it does that on every request more than once. That really slows down your site, and it also puts a higher load on my SQL. So let's stop WordPress coming to this database every page load to find out just what site URL it lives under. So I've added these two lines to WP config. When home and site URL are defined as constant, WordPress won't go to the database to find out what these are. There's also some other constants you can add here, which I haven't listed, which also stop it going to the database for other things, but these are the main two. And that means that we've got a lot less database calls. But now we have a slightly different database for each of our environments. So, for example, here we've got my site, which is my production WP config file, but my staging one looks like that. So I've got the same file with two different bits of information in it, which how I'm going to manage that with version control. This is not an improvement, actually. This makes things more difficult. So what we could do is something like this. We've got an if statement around it, based on the host name or the IP, and loading different settings for different environments. And that's a quick win, and that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But also, have you noticed that in WP config, we've got our database credentials. So we're storing our passwords, and then we're pushing it up to someone's repo somewhere, our password to our database. This isn't very good. Never put your passwords in your repo, even private ones, because one day that, even if it's the most secure repository, like GitHub, we can mostly trust GitHub, but that one day that might become a public repository, and you'll have forgotten that you've kept these credentials in your database, and then you can just search GitHub for password and find out what your password is. So let's not do that. One solution is to not commit your WP config file. But, I mean, throughout this talk, I've just talked about quite a few changes there, and we don't want to lose them and have to rewrite those every time. So that's not very good. We need to separate out our the server-specific variables from the rest of WP config. And there's a library that helps us do this in a really nice way. It's called .env. It's a library for defining environment variables. It's also available in Ruby Dave. And what I'll do is I'll require this with Composer. So here's our Composer file again, and I've just added the .env library to the bottom line Composer, and Composer install. And that will install the library for me. This is what a .env file looks like. It lives in the root of our document, of our repository, and it's just a key value pair of settings. And you see here I've got my site URL here to /WordPress, which I mentioned before. So these are all the credentials which are going to be different for different environments. Now I need to make some changes to WP config to use these settings instead of just having them hard-coded to WP config. So what I've done here is I've required the autoloader for Composer, so it will load this library in. For our plugins, we didn't have to do this because plugins are auto-loaded by WordPress anyway. But this is a new library that I'm just sticking in. It's a standard library. It's going to be in the vendor folder, so I need to use the autoloader for Composer. Then I've used .env load here. So that will load my .env file. .env.env is the default name, so it knows where to go and find that. I could call that something different, but I'd have to specify the name of it, or the directory and then the name of it, so it knows where to go and find it. There's a really powerful thing it does called required here, a function that you can call, and you can give it a list of settings that you want to be in the .env file, so they match up with what I've got here. If any of these aren't defined, it'll instantly throw an error, which I can then catch. So I can display a message to my user that says this site isn't configured correctly, or it's unlikely that would ever make its way to production anyway, but just so you can instantly know, oh, I've missed something, I need to add that to my environment file. And then here we've got our credentials as they were in WP config before, but instead of having them hard-coded, I'm just using the getEnv function, which is part of PHP, which will go and get environment variables if they're set. You could also use $env, $_env, or $_server. It also adds them to them. Probably best you go and read the documentation on .env to see what it does, but essentially this is a really nice way of defining variables on a per server basis and then being able to load them in without having this file committed up to my repo. So I've added it to my gitignore because I don't want that file in my repository, and for each server I will make a new .m file. If you're using provisioning like Ansible or Chef or Puppet, you can get it to create that file on the fly when you provision new servers, and you can store your credentials such as your passwords in your vault. Okay, so to summarize, using .m allows us to have less calls to our database, which makes WordPress faster loading. It's really easy to update. That file is very simple, and there's no real syntax you have to learn for that. And our credentials are not in our repository. Databases. Version control for databases is tricky. And Git isn't the tool for that. There's a plugin called Revisor which adds Git, like a GUI for Git to WordPress. It doesn't do it particularly nicely. One thing it does allow you to do is add a MySQL dump of your database to each commit. But to be honest, WordPress has an excellent post-revision feature. So if you want to roll back to some previous content, WordPress is really great for doing that. So all you really need to do is back up your database. We do it using Amazon S3. We use the command line tool for this, and it just does a nightly backup which runs on a cron task and copies our database and puts it in an S3 bucket. And that's all we really do to databases. We also created something called Bosch. Bosch is an open source app, but it's something we're thinking about doing once we fix all the bugs. It's a set of scripts that we use for helping with our deployments and our local development. One of the scripts is a database sync script, and what that does is we tell it where we want to sync from and where we want to sync to. So say our production server to our local machine, and that will go and run commands such as MySQL dump and secure copy to get that database file, move it back to our local machine, run the install on it, and then it also runs a couple of MySQL commands on it just to make sure that all the admin and email addresses and things like that are all set to me instead of my client, so I don't accidentally send emails to them about stuff while I'm developing. And that's all just Linux commands, and you can actually write a script yourself to do that. But we might maybe make this open source. It also uses rsync, another command line tool, to do the same for our uploads. So uploads are not committed to our repository. This keeps our repository small. I'm sure a lot of you have been in a situation where you've got a 16 by 16 pixel square that you need to fill an image with, and your client has uploaded to WordPress a 4 megabit image for that. And you know, PDFs of the entire site content for some reason, and that's all has to go in your repo and make a repo huge and stuff. So we don't commit those, partly for that reason, but mainly because if you're keeping your uploads in Git, as soon as someone uploads a new file, your Git's out of date. So and as soon as your version control is out of date, it kind of renders it a little bit useless, because you can't just throw your files back up onto a new server and know that what you've got in your version control is what you need for the site. One solution to this is to just leave your uploads on the server and maybe again back them up to S3 or something like that, which is what we do. You can add something like an Apache rule, or I'm sure there's an NUX equivalent of this. And all this does is basically it tries to request the file from wp-content/uploads. If it can't find it, it'll go to my production site and load that for me instead. So when I'm working locally, I'll have my local files, but all the uploads will be loaded from my live site. And that's a nice quick solution. As I say, we use the Bosch scripts, which allow us to sync our uploads between our different servers. But until that kind of gets released, that's a nice quick fix for that. Okay, this is my last section. Bedrock. So I've mentioned this before. I mentioned that we're using the the MU plugin autoloader. But Bedrock is more than that. Bedrock is a full stack WordPress platform, and it's open source, and it comes with some really cool features. So it uses Composer, but it also comes with Capistrano, which you can use for your deployments if you want. We don't. We use the Bosch scripts, which I mentioned, to do our deployments for us, but it basically does it in the same way Capistrano does. It's just written in Bash, not Ruby. And we can also manage our servers with Vagrant and Ansible. So it comes with its own Vagrant box and Ansible provisioning, so you don't have to write those for your Bedrock install. Some differences between what I've just talked about and the way Bedrock does it. For example, here we've got app. So I call mine WP content because it works nicely with the way the packages install themselves from WP packages. They call theirs app. I came across a problem with this. I was using a plugin that was not very well developed, shall we say, and it had some hard-coded links to the JavaScript files and the image files, and they wanted me to be serving my files from WP content, but my files actually lived in app here. So the way I got around that was I just made a symbolic link on the command line, which made a WP content and pointed it at app. That was a quick win. App and WP, again, they call theirs WP, not WordPress. But I showed you earlier how you can you can have that call whatever you like. Live within a web directory, so anything that's not inside web here is not web accessible. And WP config is pretty empty. It just requires this file application, which is where they do all their setting up. So you can see they've got .env in here. It does. It basically does the job of WP config, but they've just separated out the concerns bit there, which is quite nice. It's got some deployment settings for Capistrano. It's got an Ansible folder and Vagrant folder for those as well, and it all comes out of the box. I don't always use Bedrock. It depends on my needs. It depends on whether I'm working in a team as well. I tried using Bedrock at home, and it was just for little projects, and it was a bit much. And I actually found it easier to go down the route that I've explained. You might be sitting there wondering why I didn't just point you in the direction of the Bedrock documentation. We could all go to the pub. And the reason is it took me a long time to figure out actually what Bedrock was doing, and more importantly, why it was doing some of the things it was doing. So things like the using .env, for example, and why that was a good system to use. So I'm just going to summarise some of the things we've been through. So by using Bedrock or using just the Composer and the Git workflow with WordPress, we only keep in our version control what we need to. Our dependencies are managed, and they're self-documenting as well. We can see exactly what plugins we're using and what versions of those plugins we're using and what version of WordPress we're using. We've improved the speed and the efficiency of WordPress, just stopping it going to the database every 2 seconds to find out what URL it lives under. The passwords are out of our repo, so that's a good security win. And there's easy configurations of our environment settings. That's my talk. That's where we're going after this. Are there any questions?
I got one. It's quite common to use caching plugins like WT Cache and the others out there, whatever they are. How do you manage those? Because I know they write files to funky directories, so do you just not bother about them? Or
we usually add the folders that they write to our git ignores file, so we make sure that they're not being committed. I know a lot of them, it's not something I have a lot of experience with, but I know that they come with easy ways to flush the caches to WP admin. As far as I know, you just use it in the same way as any other plugin, so you require that with Composer. I think the main thing is just making sure Git ignore that cache folder, so you're not committing cache files up. Cool. What would Alex?
Why did you choose to write a set of bash scripts instead of using Capistrano to deploy if they get you Capistrano out of the box?
I knew this was coming because you asked me this at work.
How prepared you?
The thing about Capistrano with Composer is that Capistrano works by putting, you've got a folder for releases, and when you deploy, it'll push all the files up to a new release folder, which has like a unique string. I think it's a timestamp maybe, and it puts all your files into that folder. And then it runs some scripts on that, such as Composer, to install the dependencies for Composer. And then once it's done all that, it'll make that the main version by symlinking the document root to this release folder. But what that means is that on your server, you have to have Git, and you have to have Composer, and you have to have Ruby, and you have to have Compass, and all the other things that you're using as part of your deployment. It means your production, yeah, it means your production machine has to be up to date with all the latest versions of the tools that you use for development. So the deploy script we wrote for Bosch, it does it a little bit differently in that it runs all these scripts locally, and then instead of using Git or anything to go and clone the repo on the server, we just copy when we run all these scripts in a distribution folder, so it clones the repo into a new folder, runs these scripts, and then we just copy those files. We use SCP, and we just copy them up to the server. So our server can be dumb, and it doesn't need to know about all the tools that we're using. Now, I know you're sat there going, Capistrano does do this, but it's not very intuitive from my experience of Capistrano. I'm not a Ruby developer, I'm a PHP developer, and I know Bash isn't PHP either, but Bash is quite a simple language, and it meant I didn't need to learn Ruby just to do my deploys.
No more questions.
What's the next stage, and what do we do next if we had a week or two?
To my talk, or to
to making WordPress better for developers.
The first thing I would do is I'm just going to skip back. Wow, I did talk about a lot, didn't I? Here we are. That's what I do. I would make WordPress have a Composer file so I could require it as a package. So I don't have to require on this John Block guy who I've never met. I'm sure he's a very good developer, and this is really useful. And saved me a lot of time having to make my own composer packages for every version of WordPress. But it would be nice if WordPress did this themselves. So that would be my first step. John?
How much of Bosch was inspired by my incessant need for front-end tools?
A lot of it.
Yeah. We like Composer and we like Git, being PHP developers, and they're great. And then every now and then we suddenly have to start using something like Compass or join
Node.js or something.
Yeah, Node.js. What's that? It's a lot of tools, and there's a lot of tools to keep just updated on your dev machine. I mean, we have problems at work where one of us is using Ansible 1.8, which was installed as part of Ubuntu, and then someone else is using Ansible 1.9, which was installed from source. And there's just a mismatch of versions that we're using, and we're just sat next to each other. So to keep all our servers in check as well is a lot of work, just keeping on top of the updates. So that's one of the reasons we went. Yes, John, you. We.
I was the one with the Ansible installed.
I know you touched on it earlier, and we're all developers, so we all like the idea of having completely managing all aspects of WordPress, manage all the versions of plugins and all that sort of stuff, which is great. You know. But do you think the WordPress project itself is working towards a better developer workflow? And do you feel that taking it out of the hands of the average kind of WordPress user who loves to just chuck in plugins here and there, how do you feel this kind of more dev-focused workflow is it aligned with the WordPress kind of aim or core goal of making it really easy to set up a blog, essentially?
I have enormous respect for the people who are managing WordPress and developing WordPress, because they seem to be all about their users, and their user base is massive as well. So that's a lot of users to take in consideration, and they are trying to keep everyone happy. Unfortunately, that does lead to some things in WordPress which we look at and we kind of go because it's from a technical point of view, it's a mess, but it's trying to keep everyone happy, and they are really passionate about making sure that they're doing a lot of work at the moment to move over to Git, for example, instead of using SVN, to help developers like us who are working in big teams and working for companies to be able to use WordPress and not be hindered by it. But they're also still really passionate about making sure that the standard Joe blogs can go and make Joe's blog.
They're in a difficult position, because if they change something that breaks 1% of sites, that's millions of sites.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's a lot of internet that they've got. Yeah. So it's not been easy switching to using Composer. We've had a few hiccups along the way. And that's why I wanted to go through the process of how it works, because when I first started using Bedrock, I was like, oh, this is amazing, oh, I can use Composer, I can require this package and stuff. But then I started to hit a few hiccups where I had to actually start looking at it and go, how does this work? Because I need to be able to do something. I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but and then I had to actually go and look at how Composer installers work, for example, how adding that line to tell it where I want to install something to, something like that. Yeah, how this works, because I had a plugin that I didn't want. It wasn't a plugin. It was I can't remember. It's something that I didn't want installed in plugins. So you've got here you define that you want a certain type to be installed into a certain place, but you can also just define a package name. So if I wanted to put this package here somewhere completely different, I can just make a new rule for that. And I don't have to define type here, I just literally put the name of the package in there and it will go and install in there. So it's a really powerful workflow and it doesn't hold you back at all once you work out how it's working. I realise I flew through this and it's going to be quite an overload for people, but as I say, I'll be putting this online, and the Bedrock documentation is also excellent. They've got tutorials and videos and things on there. Some of them you have to pay for, but I think going forward, WordPress development will be, especially within teams, it's going to be a lot better going forward because of this.
Okay, I think we're going to have to call it there because we need a little bit of time to pack up. But as Dave said at the beginning, we are heading down to Camden where we've got the meal deals and various other bits and pieces. So if you want to join us for social, for beer, for something to eat and talk some more, please come on down to we'll be up at Camden. Ben, thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much.